From drinking a beer on a Sunday afternoon to taking the subway from the Sydney airport, we're going to be going over some of the things that you should never do in Sydney. A lot of tourists make these mistakes and they live to regret it, so make sure you watch this video the whole way through. And without further ado, let's get into mistake number 1, and that would be taking the subway from the Sydney airport. Whether you're flying international or domestic, the subway terminals at the airport are privately owned. They're actually owned by a pension company out in the UK. What this means for you as a tourist is that the subway terminal fares are set at whatever this private company deems best. Right now, they're setting them at over $16 a person. When I was living in the city, even if I was coming in all on my own, it was actually cheaper for me to take an Uber to my apartment than it would be for me to take the subway. And if you're a group of 2 or a family of 4, I can almost guarantee that a lot of destinations in Sydney are going to be cheaper to reach by Uber than by subway. This is only if you take the airport terminals, by the way. If you happen to have a little bit more time on your hands, one option that's even cheaper is to get a bus at the Sydney airport, take it to Mascot Station, and then get on the subway there. As of 2024, to the best of my knowledge, all other subway stations in Sydney are owned by the government, which means the fares are much more reasonable. Now on to mistake number 2, and the mistake that a lot of tourists make right after they get off that subway that they paid way too much for. And this would be going to a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, or even a gas station if you're renting a car. The reason I recommend you avoid these stores isn't because they're shady or dangerous. In fact, Sydney is one of the safest cities in the world, which means pretty much anywhere you go, you're going to be fairly safe. The reason I recommend you avoid convenience stores, gas stations, and 7-Elevens is because of the time you're likely to be visiting these stores. In the middle of the day or at 6 p.m., you're going to walk into these stores and end up paying double or even triple what these products would sell for in a Kohl's or Woolworths. Typically, these will be located nearby the convenience stores. They're going to have many more options and they're going to be much cheaper. Convenience stores, 7-Elevens, and gas stations charge so much because they're open 24/7 and they're located throughout the city. If you're looking to save a little bit of time or you're looking to get a drink late at night, this is going to be the perfect opportunity to visit one of these places. Besides for this, for a lot of locals, these stores will sell foreign items that you can't really get anywhere else in the city. However, you, being an international traveler, or even a domestic traveler, are probably looking to sample some of Sydney's wares rather than some of the things that are imported into Sydney. And while we're talking about places to avoid, let's get into mistake number 3, which would be to avoid souvenir shops. In the 5 years that I've lived in Sydney, I've almost never stepped foot inside of a souvenir shop. And it's not because I don't buy souvenirs or gifts for people back home, it's because there's a much better option located centrally inside of the city. And this would be Paddy's Market. It's a massive sprawling market that has tons of stalls selling every souvenir that you could ever imagine at a pretty significant discount compared to local souvenir shops. Inside of Paddy's Market, you're gonna find some amazing deals, some insane wares, and some very interesting products, not all of which I can guarantee aren't counterfeit. It's a great place to go shopping for souvenirs and find some rather unique looking t-shirts that you could pretty much only find on Alibaba. Also, while we're talking about Paddy's Market, if you go up to the top floor, there's an amazing selection of restaurants up there. This isn't a thing to avoid, this is actually something you should definitely check out. However, if you do plan to visit these restaurants or any restaurants and cafes within the city, mistake number 4 is an important one, and this would be do not just go to a place and expect it to be open, and don't expect it to keep the hours that you would normally expect it to keep. One of the most frustrating things I ran into when I moved to Sydney was shops, stores, and even cafes closing a lot earlier than I expected them to. For instance, in Sydney, pretty much any cafe worth its salt is going to be closing at 2 or 3 p.m. This felt early to me as an American, but once you get used to life Sydney side, it isn't. In addition to this, if you're going to a restaurant, a lot of them are going to have their kitchens closing at 9, and if you want to go shopping, you've pretty much got to do it between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. A lot of the best shops will close. However, things are getting a little bit better when it comes to grocery stores and some stores like Target or Kmart. That said, you shouldn't completely fear for your trip because there is a light at the end of this tunnel. On Thursdays, shops do stay open later. Thursdays in Australia, there's a thing called late night shopping where a lot of shops stay open until 8 p.m. or even 9 p.m. if the owner's extremely crazy. And while we're on the topic of cafes, restaurants, and everything like that, let's move on to mistake number 5, and this would be do not tip. Sydney and Australia in general does not have a tipping culture. Every now and then, a machine might show you the option to tip, but this is not something that people expect. Even if you think that waiter is looking at you longingly, hoping that you give them a little bit of a tip, They don't need it. The minimum wage here is extremely high, people are paid extremely well, and tipping is not expected. There are a lot of things that I love about the US. It's my home country, but this is one thing that I don't love, so please, leave the tips at home and just pay what you're asked to pay. Mistake number 6. While we're talking about minimum wage and how much you're expected to pay people, let's get into why drinking a beer at 6 p.m. on a Sunday might not be the best idea. And I'm not recommending you don't go out to eat or don't go out to drink on a Sunday or Saturday, but I do want people to be aware of this. Minimum wage in Sydney is extremely high. As of the recording of this video, the minimum wage is set to $23.23 an hour. However, this isn't exactly true. On Saturdays, minimum wage for a lot of workers is 150% of what they typically earn. So if you're earning $23.23 an hour, you can add 50% to that. And on Sundays, minimum wage is 200% of what a person would typically earn. Now, at this point in the video, you're probably wondering why this matters to you. Minimum wage is something for people who plan to work in Sydney, not people who plan to visit. Well, the reason it matters is because on weekends, a lot of restaurants charge a surcharge. So when you're looking at the menu, look at the bottom of the menu and see if there's a little asterisk indicating that there is an extra charge or service charge on Saturdays or Sundays. I'm not recommending that you completely avoid going out to eat on these days, but if you have an expensive meal planned, maybe you don't want to plan it on a Sunday. Or maybe you do. And if you're 6 minutes into this video, maybe another thing you'd want to do is hit the subscribe button. Whether you're planning a trip to Sydney, Australia, or just interested in travel, this channel has a lot of things that you're probably interested in. And by hitting the subscribe button, not only do you help support this channel and help me make more videos, you're going to help yourself by telling YouTube to notify you, or at least let you know algorithmically anytime I've got a new video out that you might be interested in. Now let's move on to mistake number 8, and this would be for all of you who are out there smoking. Yes, it's bad for your health, but did you know it's also really bad for your wallet if you visit Australia? Australia has one of the highest taxes on tobacco, and it comes in at over 65%. This means if you're going to Sydney and you're planning to buy a pack of cigarettes, expect to pay about 60 Australian dollars. If this doesn't sound bad to you, maybe you want to keep smoking, but if it does, maybe you want to bring cigarettes with you, or better yet, just give up the habit for your trip. And now I'm going to get off my soapbox and get on to another one and tell you to wear sunscreen. Australia has a bit of an ozone issue, and what this means is UV light in Australia is extremely intense. Even during the winter, you need to wear sunscreen a lot of the days that you go out. As someone who just had kids and was warned by many nurses not to take them out in the middle of the day, I can tell you that sunscreen is a must if you plan on visiting Australia. Skin cancer rate here is extremely high. In fact, Australia, because of the amount of skin cancer it has some of the best skin cancer treatment clinics in the world. Despite that, I recommend that you try your best to avoid them. So when you come to Australia, if you don't want your trip to be ruined by sunburn or your life to be affected by skin cancer, put on that sunscreen. It's going to help, it's going to keep you from burning, and it's going to make your trip all that more enjoyable. And don't worry, you'll still get a tan in the middle of December because it's summer here. The UV is extremely high, the sun's extremely hot, and the beach is calling all of our names. And the next thing I've got to avoid in Sydney is cruises. Not necessarily cruises. There's some really nice harbor cruises out there that I'd recommend you take if you do have the budget for it. But if you don't have the budget for it, I'd recommend you avoid them because there is a better way and a cheaper way to see the Sydney harbor. And that would be to take a ferry. Ferries in Sydney work like any other public transportation system. Just like the subway or the buses, they're going to get you from point A to point B. Ferries just happen to do it in a much nicer way, through the Sydney harbor. So if you're looking to see the Sydney harbor on the cheap, the best way to do it would be to book a ferry from Sydney to Manly. You can go explore Manly, some of the amazing beaches there, come back to the city and have paid about $14 for the whole trip. While a cruise might run you $50 or more. And while we're on tips involving cruises and everything like that, the other tip I have is do not book a whale watching tour at the end of your vacation. Whale watching tours in Sydney are extremely popular, and I definitely recommend going on one. I've gone on 2 and I loved it. Both times we saw whales, they jumped out of the water, it was a beautiful sight. But what all these tours recommend, or all these tours guarantee, is that you will see whales. If you don't see any whales, and one of the tours I took, it seemed like we might not, they give you a guarantee that you can come back for free on another whale seeing tour. But you gotta make sure you're in the city. So book those tours early so that if you don't see any whales, you can come back another day and hopefully see some. Also, the same applies to helicopter tours or even dinner cruises. They can get canceled for a variety of reasons, and the last thing you want to do is end up having a non refundable ticket canceled and rescheduled for a day or two later when you're going to be in a whole another city or even country. And while we're talking about watching, another thing I'd recommend is watch out for traffic. A lot of tourists come to Sydney and they only look one way. My tip would be don't do this. The reason for that is because traffic in Sydney drives on the other side of the road, at least from an American or mostly European perspective. The British drive on the same side as the Australians. But if you're from a different country, that might not be the case. So when you're in Sydney, just look both ways. It's extremely easy and it's going to save you from an untimely visit to the hospital, which is one of the places I definitely recommend tourists don't check out. They're great, but they're not that interesting. And the final tip I'd like to leave you with is an important one. In fact, it's probably one of the most important ones in this video, and that would be don't stress too much about your trip to Sydney. Sydney is one of the best places that you can travel in the world. It's a little bit expensive, but as long as you planned ahead for that, you're going to be fine. It's one of the safest cities in the world. The people are some of the friendliest people you'll meet. It's an amazing place and everybody is looking out for you. It's one of the only cities that I'd feel comfortable just leaving my phone sitting out on a table and walking away. I've come to many cafes and seen laptops worth $2,000 or $3,000 sitting out unattended. I've walked by parks and seen people just leave their phones sitting on a bench, and the phones are perfectly untouched and perfectly fine. A lot of the people here are some of the nicest people you'll meet, and they're some of the most honest people you'll meet. So don't stress too much about coming to Sydney. People here are going to help you out, and they're going to try their best to make your trip an amazing one. So hopefully I'll see you down in Sydney, and hopefully you'll hit subscribe so you can see more videos like this. But if you're looking for a video going over some of the places that most tourists miss in Sydney, I'd recommend this video. It goes over some amazing spots in Sydney that a lot of tourists and even locals don't know.